Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online Psych, Culture, and Society course, and I'm here to walk you through all the hottest topics across the world in psychology. Today we're going to look at physical health, so let's jump into it. In the theme of this chapter, despite the notion that physical health is a biological issue, it is still strongly related to many psychological variables. Beginning with biological variability in humans. Human biology varies across culture, and this variability has two different explanations. Innate biological differences, the divergence of the human genome due to different selection pressures experienced by humans in different parts of the world over generations. Theoretically, these are biological or genetic variations are independent of cultural/environmental effects. Acquired biological differences, they result from different cultural experiences within one's lifetime in diverse locations that affects one's biology. Shape of feet differing due to whether or not one wears shoes regularly, for example. That is, it's a cultural effects on one's biology. Scientists in this field do not think of these factors as either or a strict dichotomy. Genes and culture do not trade influence. In most cases, both are involved and have to work together in one's current ecology, but also over time as a gene-cultural coevolution to lead to different traits or outcomes. So this is the terms we're working with for this chapter, and this is kind of a theoretical. Many developmental psychologists kind of take offense to or kind of debate the idea of innate biological anything, but kind of just for the purposes of this chapter and for this class, we kind of have this dichotomy wherein theoretically there are innate biological differences, kind of just selection pressures and kind of just natural species-specific patterns of development that occur independent of cultural or environmental effects. Again, debated concept overall, but that's kind of the idea working with. One reason kind of why it's debated is because it's kind of tough to tell, over thousands of years, what were the environmental effects, and are these innate or are these so-called innate things with an individual, something that happens, thousands of years ago or across many generations, because we know that there's intergenerational developmental patterns that happen at the genome level. But again, whatever, we're sticking with this for the purpose of this chapter. And then we have acquired, which is kind of just typical like nurture kind of thing, or just kind of environmental effects, wherein person's different cultural experiences, in this case, affect one's biology. And the argument for the final bullet point is basically that these genes, kind of broadly stated, which in this case genes meaning innate biological differences, and culture. So basically what it's saying, nature and nurture just don't turn off, but rather they kind of work in this like codependence and kind of interact dynamically across time. Genetic variations in populations. Humans, like all organisms, evolved due to selective pressures in their environments. Their different environments have different selection pressures, leading different populations to evolve specific traits. Genetic variability allows us to track human migration history around the globe, and a lot of genetic variability emerges as a result of responses to selection pressures in those particular environments. It means that individuals tend to share genetic variance with people who have similar ancestral traits, or origins, I should say. So kind of broadly stated, kind of the idea here is kind of this basic evolutionary theory. There are selective pressures within the environment, and those pressures, those environmental pressures, contribute to the development and impact kind of the evolution of species, like broadly, but kind of contribute to specific traits of human development. And you can see this in specific traits, and one of which we're going to get into momentarily. But the idea being just that these environmental factors impacting phenotype, genetic expression. So basically the idea just evidence of genetic expression that you can visibly see. That's what I mean by phenotype. Now let's jump into a specific example, skin color across different populations. Humans require vitamin D to repair the body. The human body synthesizes vitamin D from sunlight, but it can't do that unless the skin absorbs ultraviolet radiation, UVR, from the sun. Too much UVR causes breakdown of folic acids, which has negative downstream effects on health, such as anemia, birth defects, or skin cancer. Humans first emerged in Africa, where there are relatively higher UVR levels, so they evolved to have darker pigment or melanin in the skin to absorb enough UVR for vitamin D, but not enough to break down folic acid. Darker skin has a greater survival advantage than lighter skin in this context by allowing just enough UVR in to synthesize vitamin D without leading to damage done to the body. When humans migrated to places with lower UVR levels, such as Europe, they evolved lighter skin to absorb more UVR to synthesize enough vitamin D for the body. So kind of the idea here, we have these environmental pressures interacting with kind of species-specific innate biological needs, in this case the need for vitamin D, and kind of interacting with that environmental pressure, in this case UVR rays, which as stated, too much UVR causing skin cancer and just other poor health outcomes. So kind of needing to find that balance. Thus, one way to evolve in response to that selection pressure, that is to get enough UVR rays to live but not kill yourself through cancer, is to have darker skin tone. And when humans migrated to other areas with less UVR rays, you would expect to see a decrease in melanin in the body because there's less UVR. Thus, there's less need to block excessive UVR rays because there's just less UVR rays present in that environment. So the environmental pressures are different. So the need to have vitamin C in the body interacting with environmental pressures, contributing to differences in variation in melanin production within humans. In some empirical evidence for this genetic variation in melanin, research shows that skin color strongly correlates with ultraviolet radiation that reaches different parts of the globe, such that, in general, people have darker skin tones in places that have more relative to less UVR. An exception to this is the Inuit populations in the north, who have darker skin than would be expected, primarily because their diet already consists of a lot of vitamin D from eating fish and mammal blubber. Skin color is an example of geographical and climate influences on population variation in the human genome, but there are other selection pressures that have affected human biology, including the presence of pathogens leading to the development of natural immunity. For example, the Spaniards had better genetic resistance to smallpox than the Incas because they had already lived with smallpox-carrying livestock for thousands of years. So an interesting example, as stated, was the Inuit population, where they would be expected to have lighter skin because there are less UVR rays where they live. Thus, you need to have lighter skin to kind of receive sufficient vitamin D for purposes of repairing bodily functions within your body. However, their diet kind of contributing to that evolutionary process, kind of reducing that environmental pressure through their diet, as stated. So because they're receiving so much vitamin D from their diet, they do not require less melanin in their skin. That is because, again, kind of less melanin contributing to greater amounts of vitamin D being absorbed by the body. So because of their diet, kind of interacting with that melanin, that quote-unquote innate process. So literally their diet kind of impacting the vitamin D levels within their body, and then thus kind of needing less vitamin D from the sun, or UVR rays more specifically. And then interestingly, as kind of another example, is kind of natural immunity to pathogens found within the environment. And the classic example of Spaniards, and kind of everybody is typically, or it's kind of typically familiar with the conquests of various regions of the West and other parts of the world, wherein various colonial powers kind of bringing with them pathogens that were not familiar to the native population, and then that killing off large amounts of people. Also, they kind of directly, purposely at times gave them smallpox, but the point here is that kind of another example of other environmental selection pressures impacting human biology. Cultural influences on the genome. Cultural factors can also influence genomic variation. One example comes from the existence of lactose tolerance or intolerance in different human populations. Most adults develop lactase non-persistence or insufficient lactase enzyme in the intestines to digest lactose sugar. It happens because lactase doesn't persist from childhood through adulthood and was common in the ancestral population of humans before the exodus from Africa. Cow domestication in northern Europe led to the development of a mutation in humans that aids in digesting milk/glucose into simple sugars, that is, lactase persistence. Genetic analysis suggests that lactase persistence developed in areas with historical cow domestication or places with the highest genetic diversity in cattle populations. Dairy farming also has been shown to predate selection of lactase persistence. Parallel genetic mutation, though distinct from the mutation common in Europe, has been found in African cultural groups that raised cattle. This is an example of gene-cultural coevolution, or the idea that as culture evolves, it places new selection pressures on the genome, which also evolves in response to those pressures. In other words, the cultural practice of dairy farming may have caused changes in human genes linked to lactase persistence. So way in the beginning of the class, we actually talked about this with kind of the invention and the use of fire for cooking and how that impacted the development of the size of humans and kind of their digestive system. And this is kind of a similar idea here. So we see that most adults, it's thought, were lactase non-persistent as they reach adulthood, that was common prior to kind of immigrating out of Africa. But however, as different cultural practices developed in other parts of Europe, such as cow domestication, that created an environmental pressure wherein kind of the human genome kind of adapting to those cultural practice and kind of altering the enzyme production of and thus kind of improving the ability to digest lactose, and as stated, kind of referred to as lactase persistence. So kind of, again, these cultural practices, these developments in technology are different ways of kind of organizing not countries, but at this case kind of like territories or areas or city-states, impacting the human genome by creating different cultural specific environmental pressures. And it's not just found in Northern Europe, but also, as stated, in African cultural groups that also relied heavily on cattle, kind of demonstrating an increased tolerance of the ability to digest lactose in adulthood. Culture can also influence genetic variation indirectly. An example of this is when people began farming yams in West Africa. It required clearing forests. An unintended side effects of clearing the forests was that it increased the amount of standing water after rain, which led to the proliferation of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Malaria spread in these regions and became a selective force for malaria resistance. Eventually, a genetic mutation emerged for hemoglobin that is linked to sickle cell anemia, but this has the benefit of resistance to getting malaria. Populations without yam farming did not develop this same genetic mutation. Cultural practice of yam farming eventually led to biological adaptation of resistance to malaria. So kind of the idea here is this indirect because a decision to participate in specific farming practices, or in this case, farming specific crops, in this case, yams in West Africa, requiring a modification of the environment, that is cutting down the forest, that then created, that contributed to higher amounts of Water, standing water being present, so stationary water, which we're kind of all familiar with in Florida, is kind of like a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Thus, that increases the amount of mosquitoes, and then over time, that presence of mosquitoes created kind of a pressure, environmental pressure, wherein humans evolved, and one evolution, kind of like one genomic evolution, genetic mutation, was to kind of be resistant against that, the danger of mosquito spreading, and specifically some types of malaria, and that being sickle cell. So sickle cell kind of representing an adaptation to the presence of mosquitoes within that given area. In this case, acting indirectly, because again, cut down the forest because you want to farm something. That forest leads to rising water or stationary water, which contributes to the increase in mosquitoes. Okay, well, we have to survive. So over time, humans kind of reacting to that environmental pressure on a biological level, on a genetic level, by developing and adjusting kind of the hemoglobin abnormalities in red blood cells. So kind of an adaptation to the environment. You can actually see this in other areas where there are large parts of mosquitoes, so kind of along the Mediterranean, Italy. Just as similar kind of maybe different crops, but kind of similar idea here is kind of reacting to the presence of mosquitoes, increasing the likelihood of sickle cell anemia, which is, for the record, different from sickle cell disease. Acquired physical variation across cultures. Physical traits can also be affected by cultural practices, such as wearing shoes can affect the shape of a person's feet. Another example is the Moken, sea nomads in Southeast Asia. They're predominantly in islands in disputed territory between Thailand and Burma, who live on boats for 7 or 8 months a year and depend on diving for food from the ocean. Underwater vision tends to be blurry, and being able to see clearly underwater would make it more likely to catch sea life. Moken children learn from a young age to swim underwater to retrieve seafood, and they have more than twice the underwater visual acuity of European children. Likely not a genetic adaptation. Research shows that specialized ability is acquired through practice, and European children can be trained to develop it. So kind of just the idea here that given this environmental constraint, or within this culture we're in, we gather food through kind of sea exploration or diving specifically, and are much more water-based and being populating a boat and living in a boat, or being in a boat just in general, a lot longer than typical cultures, contributing to specific actions needed to survive, specific behaviors. In this case, needing to dive all the time, and through kind of experience, through that just repetitive diving exercises, children kind of adapt and kind of develop a better ability to see really kind of like underwater. So kind of just through this developmental context, contributing to the physical traits of this particular culture's abilities to see through water. And this is kind of just an example of the environment or cultural practices within a given environment impacting developmental outcomes. Body weight and obesity rates vary dramatically across countries. One study found that obesity rates are approximately 1.5% for Chinese women and 55% for Samoan women. Why do these differences exist between various groups around the world? Genetic factors predict body weight, but culture also plays an important role. For example, obesity rates have also been growing across many countries over the past few decades. Thus, genetics alone cannot account for this, and there are not been a widespread influx of people carrying genes that make humans overweight. So basically, kind of the idea here is that if something is changing over the last 30 years, kind of those evolutionary pressures take generations, in general. Wherein this is kind of a 30-year shift, thus kind of suggesting that genetics alone cannot explain it, or may not even be the main reason for variations and shifts in body weight across the world. And researchers argue that is most likely fueled by these specific cultural changes. Greater consumption of high-calorie foods, such as fast foods and sodas, larger portion sizes, sedentary lifestyle, and living in the suburbs, more driving, less exercise, which kind of correlates with all these things. So you can kind of see some correlations between these variables. But obviously there can be other variables as well, kind of in the United States with more dual income households that being the norm in the United States, more people working, more people driving to work, more work hours, higher amounts of self-reported stress and kind of generational surveys, all kind of contributing to and is correlated with kind of greater consumption of higher calorie foods and kind of sedentary lifestyle in general. Variation in the West. What is particularly intriguing is the fact that even in the West, there's considerable variation in obesity rates. For instance, France has 1/5 the obesity rate of the United States, despite French food being high in fat and sugars. And while the French have higher blood cholesterol than Americans, they also have less heart disease, are thinner, and have a longer lifespan. This is known as the French paradox. French eat a fat-rich diet, yet have far less heart disease than Americans. One potential explanation for this is that the French actually eat fewer calories than Americans do per day, due to a cultural environment that affects portion sizes and attitudes towards food. In terms of portion size, people eat what's in front of them in terms of, quote, packages or portions, not a container and a half of yogurt, which suggests that portion size matters if people eat by portions. Comparison to portion sizes in France, U.S. yogurt containers are 80% larger. It applies to other types of food as well, for example. McDonald's serves 70% more fries in the U.S. per container, and its grilled chicken sandwiches are larger in the U.S. than France. The American cultural norm for larger portion sizes may be contributing to why people consume larger amounts of calories per day, and consequently have higher rates of obesity and coronary disease. Portion sizes in the United States have been increasing over the years, contributing to increases in Americans' daily caloric intake. So this is kind of like a classic finding of research. That is, if you put whatever kind of plate that you put in front of a person, they're kind of likely to eat it because they conceptualize it as a portion. That is, like what is in front of them is kind of just like the portion. That's the food that you should be eating. And one potential consequence of this potential finding is that if you present people with larger portions in front of them, people will conceptualize it kind of as the same portion. This is what I'm supposed to eat. That's right in front of me. So thus, if you serve someone in different countries have kind of the same product, in this case kind of like McDonald's fries, and you're both being served one quote-unquote portion, but obviously the amount of fries within a given portion varies across culture. And that kind of can contribute to people eating more food and kind of more calorie intake across cultures, or contribute to variation in calorie intake across cultures, and thus potentially contributing to differences in health outcomes. And I have familiar with this myself in traveling overseas. Just kind of the differences in portion sizes are quite evident when you get food, especially French fries, and they are drastically smaller than the amount of food you would get in the United States, and it takes some time to adjust to it. There are also differences in attitudes about food in the West. The French view eating as more a leisurely and enjoyable activity than Americans do. French spend more time eating a meal at McDonald's, about twice as long as Americans, even with smaller meal sizes. French savor their food more. About 80% of French would prefer an average hotel with excellent food, compared to only 40% of Americans, who prefer instead a luxury hotel with average food. Americans, especially women, have conflicting attitudes about food. Among American females, 80% report eating low-fat products a few times a week, as compared to only 20% of French males. One of the top words American females used to describe food was fattening, which did not appear in top responses for French men or women. Americans, especially women, have more negative attitudes toward food than French, Belgians, and Japanese. People with greater cultural fit also tend to have better diets or eating habits. and cultural fit kind of being defined as the degree to which an individual's personality is compatible with the dominant values of the whole host culture. So different attitudes about food contributing to different cultural practices around food with Americans in kind of general. You can see this kind of compared to Italy and other, I believe it's Spain as well, in Western settings, spending less time eating their meals, even though they have larger portion sizes than other comparison Western countries. And they also kind of like prioritizing food. Other Western countries kind of prioritizing food as evident through or as suggestive of that hotel study. And then kind of different views of food in general, with American females, as stated, using food, or one way to describe food as fattening, while that term did not exist or was not used among the top responses to foods for French men or women. So kind of different feelings about food, different evaluations of food, kind of contributing to how much you enjoy food, how much you're willing to savor food, how much time you kind of spend relaxing, kind of making it more of kind of a social or community kind of exercise, and also, as stated, kind of your negativity towards food being impacted by those cultural practices towards food. So it's this interesting combination of relative to kind of to France at least, and some other Western European countries and Japan listed, that Americans eating, having larger portions, enjoying it less, eating it quicker, and then feeling worse about it afterwards. So kind of a interesting combination of attitudes towards food, which might be reflective of specific cultural themes within the United States. Physical health, historical trends. The average height of people in different countries around the world also has changed dramatically across historical periods, such that genetic factors alone cannot account for what happened, or for these changes. The late 19th century, the average American male was 5'8", and the average Dutch male is 5'5". Today, the average American male is 5'10", and the average Dutch male is 6'1". One potential mechanism of change is wealth effects. Economic wealth of a country has close ties with the height of its people. More wealth brings healthier diets, more vitamins and nutrients, especially at ages when growth spurts occur, and better health allows people to grow taller. This played a role with the comparison of Americans and Dutch in the previous slide, as the Dutch were going through an economic slump during the late 19th century, while the Americans were enjoying high levels of economic performance. Fluctuations of countries' average heights across time has coincided with broad societal changes that have an impact on diet. The average height of Europeans increased during the Industrial Revolution as people moved to cities and daily caloric intake dropped. Even people from generally the same genetic heritage experience great divergence in height when separation occurs. For instance, North Korean children are shorter than South Korean children by about 5 inches, and Japanese living in California in the 1950s were 5 inches taller than Japanese in Japan. So kind of this is a classic example of these macro structures, these economic periods of boom and depression, these kind of political moments contributing to biological outcomes, in this case physical height. So kind of as stated, during the late 19th century, Dutch kind of going through depression, contributing to eventual adult heights. And you can also see this kind of as stated in the during the Industrial Revolution, with people working more hours, moving to cities, having less caloric intake, also experiencing a dip in height. And we also see that kind of more globally, that the more nutrients and vitamins that you intake, especially during those very developmentally sensitive periods of growth spurts, has an impact on health and also the height that an individual will eventually reach. And actually, I've done my master's thesis was on kind of child height, and which is kind of referred to as like length at birth, and the impact of mothers experiencing high levels of trauma during pregnancy, kind of contributing to height outcomes in newborn babies, specifically looking at a military occupation of the city that these Muslims lived in. So kind of again these macro, these political, these economic and cultural moments contributing to biological outcomes. And interestingly, some post-colonial countries, that is, countries that became independent in the 1950s, 1960s period, having kind of relatively lower levels of height growth across the past 60 years, was kind of reflective of kind of neocolonialism and other issues that they had to face during the past 60 years, kind of contributing to height differences, kind of another evidence of the biological impacts of kind of those macro structures on human development. Culture and sleep. A common refrain for many in industrialized countries is to sleep for 8 hours straight. This meant to be the ideal sleeping behavior, but is that really the case? The concept actually did not emerge until relatively recently, with the advent of electric lighting. Before electric lighting, people's sleeping cycles were thought to occur in two phases. First, people went to sleep a little after sunset. Then they woke up in the middle of the night, during which they engaged in some leisurely activities such as socializing, snacking, playing music, and having sex. They then slept for a few hours again until after dawn. Sleeping patterns have been identified in subsistence societies and has been found when people are kept in a room that is dark for 14 hours a day. So in this case, kind of another example of technological evolution or specific cultural practices impacting these quote-unquote kind of innate biological processes of humans, that is sleeping. So with the invention of electric lighting, not having to rely on like a candle or to light up a room, and just having general lighting in streets and etc., kind of contributing to differences and the amount of that people sleep and kind of the ways that people sleep. And as stated, cultural practices affect not only the pattern of sleep, but also the amount of sleep that people get. The graph shows how even infants and toddlers already demonstrate cultural differences in how much they sleep in a day. These differences that are mostly reflected by adults in their cultures as well. Japanese infants sleep about 1.5 hours less than North American infants. Dutch infants sleep 1.3 hours more than American infants. And part of this may be explained by different cultures having different theories and expectations about sleep, something that will require future research. So kind of the idea here is that you can see this impact of cultural practices impacting the developmental outcomes of infants at a very young age, in this case sleep, with even infants demonstrating cultural differences in sleep habits and being reflective of their adults' sleeping habits. Another study tried to measure sleep-related physiological measures more directly by having university students in Japan and Canada wear a watch that objectively monitored quality of sleep for a week. Japanese students slept an hour less than white Canadians and Asian Canadians, suggesting that local cultural norms affected sleep more than heritage cultural norms. Japanese were not any more efficient in their sleep than Canadians. They didn't fall asleep faster or wake fewer times in the night. They just seemed to be getting by on less sleep. Japanese also indicated that their ideal sleep amount was an hour less than Canadians. Canadians report being more tired than Japanese, even though they got more sleep. So kind of the idea here is that a few takeaways here, that we are demonstrating potential cultural differences. These findings suggest cultural differences in sleep patterns, and also the self-reported levels of fatigue, even with, and that is in this case, even with Japanese individuals getting less sleep, them reporting less fatigue than other Canadian university students. And also you see an acculturation effect, wherein future generations, that is first or second gen, whatever this study was, of Japanese Canadians or Asian Canadians more broadly, not demonstrating the same sleep patterns as individuals from their heritage culture, that is Japanese culture norms, which again kind of provides evidence of a cultural effect on sleep patterns. Mortality in class. The general health, though, is also affected by different aspects of our cultural environment, such as class indicators like household incomes. Mortality rates are higher among lower-income Americans, and patterns can be found in other industrialized countries as well as certain non-industrialized countries. and especially kind of in the United States. There are numerous reasons come to mind on this association between income and health outcomes, but as stated, this has been found in other Western contexts as well. But just kind of having less access to resources, so economic, obviously, but also social resources. Having access to nutritious food, having access to opportunities to exercise or just not be stressed as much, kind of probably accumulating together to kind of impact mortality outcomes in lower class individuals. Income levels appear to be associated with links to health via several psychosocial variables. There are certain psychological personality characteristics, I should say. Examples are hostility and pessimism. This is likely to be due to lower school achievement in low-income environments, which bars people from certain employment opportunities. Such environments also lead them to encounter more delinquent and criminally dangerous behaviors. These experiences may foster a sense of mistrust and cynicism. All this leads to a sense of hostility and pessimism, contributing to poor health. Another psychosocial link is the availability of cognitive resources to make sound decisions. Impoverished people are more likely to engage in short-term strategies that undermine decision-making. Poverty preoccupies people with having to make difficult choices and trade-offs for survival, which siphons mental resources away from higher-order decisions. For instance, sugarcane farmers in southern India perform better on cognitive tasks after they harvested their crops, when they had sufficient income, compared to before harvesting their crops, when they were worried about how to pay their bills. So kind of the argument here is that certain environments, and specifically in this case lower class environments, kind of contributing to the development of specific personality characteristics. For this example, hostility and pessimism. So kind of the idea here is that you live in a low income area, and obviously there's going to be less job opportunities. There's less opportunities to kind of achieve what it is that you're seeking, at least in the United States, is kind of like as an individual. And there's kind of like often the only time you interact with the state or, government or kind of any kind of institutions is kind of through kind of like a punishment lens or kind of having to jump through hurdles. So this kind of creates and contributes to kind of a sense of pessimism and hostility to the world around you because you kind of rightly view that you kind of hang out here out to dry. There's really no kind of future for you. You have really no means of changing these kind of larger structures. Therefore, these individuals are at higher risk of delinquent behaviors, and it's kind of expressing a sense of mistrust, kind of for obvious reasons. And through this kind of sense of mistrust and kind of just a lack of resources within these impoverished areas, thus having like lower amounts of hospitals, lower amounts of nutritious food, more just stressors in general, worrying about how pay bills, etc., contributing to kind of a sense of pessimism, which kind of then adds another layer of stress on top of it. So kind of these objective and subjective stressors contributing to poor health outcomes. So kind of, and then the second point, kind of this cognitive resources point, is that the environment kind of necessitates certain strategies for decision making and certain kind of adaptations or environmentally influenced adaptations for cognitive strategies and kind of other neurological development or possibly or behavioral development. Being where and kind of specifically wherein short-term strategies are more beneficial. So even though it may be maladaptive in some settings, within that setting it is adaptive because it's very difficult to kind of plan out a future in those kind of unstable environments. Therefore, kind of relying on short-term decision making can be beneficial in that short term, but that can also obviously lead to long-term health issues. So it's kind of an adaptation to environment that kind of like all adaptations are pluses and minuses in this case, an adaptation of living kind of in unstable, impoverished areas, allowing you maybe to survive at that moment, but kind of contributing to higher rates of mortality in the long run. And also the second point being that that having to kind of make difficult choices and trade-offs for survival kind of takes a lot of cognitive resources. It kind of creates this cognitive fatigue wherein you're kind of preoccupied by making those daily huge decisions of survival, which kind of then will distract you from kind of thinking more long-term or making more higher order level decisions is kind of what that means. So kind of these short-term, so by kind of the necessity to dedicate so much cognitive resources to your immediate environment, kind of because cognitive resources are finite, kind of reducing your ability to make higher order decision makings. And for example, internationally, with South Indian farmers performing better on cognitive tasks after their crops have been harvested compared to before their crops have been harvested, because after they harvested their crops and kind of theoretically have received some income, that reduces stressor, that reduces kind of frees up cognitive resources to, in this case, perform well on these cognitive tasks, with hypothetically is correlated with these other higher order decision making behaviors in the real world. Stress and lack of control. One important variable behind the impact of class is stress, which appears to affect health in two ways. One, it leads people to engage in unhealthy habits such as drinking and smoking as a coping strategy, and stress directly weakens the immune system, hindering one's ability to fight off infections. Example, some environments can induce stress. New York City has been shown to make people more stressed. People who go to or live in New York City are at an increased risk of dying from heart disease, leaving New York City is associated with decreased risk of this happening. The link between stress and health is an important predictor for people who have little control over their lives. Feeling a lack of control in life is a source of stress. Research has shown that lower class people tend to feel less control than higher class people. An interesting finding was that people with low income who felt they had a high sense of control in their lives had levels of health and well-being comparable to people with higher income. They're just kind of the source of stress beyond kind of like the immediate instability around you is kind of just feeling kind of more globally. I mean, kind of is similar, kind of just a lack of control, and for obvious reasons, as stated, it's they are not going to in their daily lives individually be able to kind of just like transform their local economy or even like the global, let alone like a global economy or political system. So that lack of control contributing to higher amounts of stress, and then also contributing to thus kind of needing to cope with that stress, and as stated, kind of various decision making and cognitive strategies that go alongside, and kind of just general attitudes that develop that also kind of reinforce behaviors, and kind of you get into this cycle that contributes, that ultimately and globally contributes to poor outcomes in lower class individuals. Income inequality. Subjective perceptions of wealth are also predictive of health. In other words, the subjective experience of feeling poor can matter in similar ways as being poor. A sense of relative deprivation, knowing others are doing better than you, may lead to stress and negative health outcomes. There are health benefits of having some money in general, such as the countries that are on the left side of the scatter plot, because it allows people to have access to life-sustaining cultural practices, such as medication. But beyond a certain level, about 30,000 annual per capita GDP, objective wealth does not predict life expectancy very well. This is particularly problematic in societies where there's a great amount of social inequality. So for example, Indians in poor province of Kerala outlive African Americans by a substantial degree, even though they are poor in absolute terms. May feel less poor where they live, where everybody else is poor, whereas poor Americans are comparing themselves to well-off Americans, which could contribute to their lower life expectancy. The relationship between a country's Gini index, which is an index of income inequality, and average life expectancy is strongly negative, with an R equals negative 0.81. Alright, so the idea here is that relative deprivation can also contribute to stress and negative health outcomes. So you can imagine kind of in the United States, which we talked about throughout this course, kind of this individualistic society where we're competing in a marketplace, not just economic, but a social marketplace. And you're performing not as well as some of your peers or just people that you know about. Thus, you can, in one approach, in the face of that relative disparity is to kind of blame yourself. You participated in this meritocracy, you relatively failed, quote unquote, and thus this is kind of reflected of you because you didn't do well enough in the marketplace. That's on you. You had the opportunity and now you failed, and thus kind of that internalization of failure or inadequacy as like a human, as an individual, contributing to higher amounts of negative self-evaluation, thus contributing to stress and then indirectly impacting health outcomes. Next, we look at countries' GDP. GDP across various countries. And basically the idea here is that income does have an impact on health outcomes, wherein individuals making under $30,000 are going to have just less economic resources, less access to medical supplies, food, nutrition, social safety, really, and just those buffering effects of those resources. So kind of less buffering effects and greater stressors and or less access to resources, contributing to lower levels of life expectancy. Now, interestingly, as stated, the higher you go up in GDP, the less predictive GDP is of life expectancy overall. And one possible reason for this is just one outlier nation. That's the U.S. being the richest country, not having health care. So individuals making $40,000, $50,000 in the United States is going to be different than another country that has kind of larger public health programs, because so now an individual making $50,000, $40,000 or whatever, having higher amounts of kind of risk associated with a health a chronic condition popping up, or kind of some kind of a health emergency situation. So you're kind of more on the hook for that. In the United States, medical bills, bankruptcy from medical bills is one of either the first or like top three reasons for bankruptcy. So kind of like that effect of the United States being the richest country, but also having these outlier approaches to kind of like social spending, possibly contributing to the decrease in predictive power of wealth in health outcomes. And kind of these cultural practices can also possibly be evident in the India province that we talked about, kind of outliving African Americans kind of to a substantial degree, even though they are poorer or as poor in kind of absolute terms. So maybe something like this kind of the collectivist, the kind of interdependent notion of poverty, or kind of being lower income, or something along those lines. Kind of that different approach to why things happen in the world, how much control you have over your life, how much are your personal achievements reflected of you yourself, or you and other people's around you, or other environmental factors, and not just achievements, but also failures as well, kind of possibly contributing to this sense of relative deprivation. And finally, this marker of Gini index, which is kind of a marker of income inequality, having a negative correlation with average life expectancy. So kind of as a review, a negative correlation is, in this case, as the Gini index goes up, that is, as income inequality goes up, life expectancy goes down. That's a negative correlation. And with that R being a 0.81 is a very high correlation coefficient, or in other words, a strong effect. Ethnicity and health. Ethnicity also is a factor in the link between class and health. Disadvantaged minorities tend to disproportionately be in lower class positions, also to experience poor health. So kind of in the United States, you see disproportional amounts of Black Americans being represented or being in lower classes. And you see this kind of consistently across the world with various disenfranchised minority groups being disproportionately represented in lower class groups. Black Americans are a clear example of health disparities among ethnic minorities. For many causes of death, the prevalence rates for Black Americans exceed those of white Americans. particularly the case with hypertension and heart disease, and particularly affects black educated men, which is contrary to what might expect based on research on education and health outcomes. What explains these differences if not education? While genetic explanations are been proposed, hypertension rates are actually much higher for African Americans compared to West Africans, for whom most Black Americans are descended, and who have comparable hypertension rates to white Americans. There is evidence that discrimination, as opposed to genetics, put people at greater risk for hypertension, especially those with high aspirations to achieve. Being a target of racism and discrimination appears to be directly related to poor health in Black Americans. Hispanic Americans tend to have better health outcomes on average compared to white Americans. So kind of the idea here is that these racial disparities obviously contributes to health disparities, wherein specific discrimination, and that could be discrimination directly with historically ignoring Black Americans' medical needs, being dismissive of them in kind of medical settings, or just having more kind of structurally having less hospitals available in Black neighborhoods, and correlated with low-income neighborhoods as well. And kind of just cumulatively, kind of every day just living your life. And interestingly, I stated kind of that Black educated Americans finding that could be one possible hypothesis for this is that kind of as you try and go up the income ladder in the United States, may be confronted with the limitations of or kind of structural barriers or discrimination barriers found within the United States, kind of contributing to higher rates of stress and thus kind of contributing to worse health outcomes. And as stated, this cannot be purely like a genetic explanation because there's studies have demonstrated that comparing West Africans or place of descendants, African countries where Black Americans descended from, their health outcomes, and specifically hypertension outcomes, and comparing them to Black Americans, and researchers finding stark differences between these two groups. The epidemiological paradox. Latinos experience good health across a variety of conditions, including disadvantaged conditions in the United States. One prominent explanation supported by data is that Hispanic Americans engage in healthier behaviors than do white Americans, for example, by drinking or smoking less. They benefit from much social support from large communities and highly value raising families. Unusually high levels of positive affect is a cultural norm with cultural scripts such as simpatico. There are possible explanations for why Latinos have such healthy outcomes, but much of the epidemiological paradox remains unsolved. The paradox, however, does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. Puerto Ricans, for example, do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans. So as shown on the previous slide, kind of the chart of relative frequency of causes of death, for many causes of death outcomes, Hispanic Americans actually are lower than white Americans in numerous causes of death, and this is known as the epidemiological paradox. And some possible explanations for this is that the strong, that possibly social support from large communities and highly valuing families in general kind of contributes to or creates kind of like this buffering effect, wherein the impacts of discrimination or less resources may be less impactful for these groups of individuals. And other kind of cultural practices such as simpatico, which we talked about in the previous chapter, but kind of just the idea of this agreeableness, this kind of gregarious approach to relationships, again, kind of possibly acting as a source of or a glue that keeps kind of family units together or even large communities together, thus buffering kind of the effects of stress or discrimination or lack of resources. But as stated, this is not applied to all groups of Latinos or Puerto Ricans, not showing some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans, and this can be for a whole host of reasons, kind of just speculation. Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the United States, which basically kind of collectively means that they are They do not receive the same amount of social benefits as other Americans do. And this kind of loss of sovereignty alongside kind of a lack of control, and possibly, and kind of in general, way higher rates of poverty in Puerto Rico compared to the average American country, or just the United States in general, as a result of kind of this history of Puerto Rico of like resource extraction, and then now kind of, or for the last over 100 years really, less kind of benefits. No, they can't vote for the president, or they can vote, but they don't have any electoral votes. And no representation in the Senate, or any voting power in the Senate. So it's kind of etc. Kind of these structural disenfranchisements. And it's kind of contributing to an environment where in something like in I believe 2019, something like 45% of the population living in poverty, as defined by the United States, was already kind of a low threshold estimate. So just these massive differences in poverty rates in Puerto Rico may be contributing to the differences in this group having less of that buffering effect, and kind of, and possibly also just the differences in migration patterns, because it's easier to, because Puerto Rico is technically part of the United States, easier migration, thus maybe can separate families, etc. But this is all speculation, but possible historical reasons why this epidemiological paradox does not apply for all of the causes of death in the same way as it does for Mexican Americans. Medical profession varies greatly by culture. Most non-Western societies make use of traditional medicines, agree that diseases are due to supernatural causes such as witches, demons, or ghosts. Relatively few of them consider infections or stress to be determinant of health. An analysis of theories of the causes of illnesses across 186 non-Western societies found that none viewed organ deterioration to be an important cause of illnesses. Only 3 societies, Ingalic, Japanese, and Siamese, saw stress as a clear cause, and only 1 Japanese viewed infection as a major cause of illness in 1980. In contrast, most Western medicines rely on the scientific method, using controlled experiments that are shared internationally, and does not consider supernatural causes to be good explanations for illnesses. Continuing on, despite the fact that an international community of doctors exists, there still is much cultural variability in how doctors view health and physical ailments, because doctors are trained within their own culture and so are products of their culture. This is particularly the case when we consider the metaphors with which doctors explain and understand the human body. In China, the metaphor of yin and yang emphasizes opposite forces in balance. Imbalances are believed to lead to illness. Imbalance can be corrected with acupuncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and lifestyle changes. In France, the metaphor of the body is, quote, terrain, translated roughly into, quote, constitution or resistance, which emphasizes a sense of balance as the key to good health by supporting the immune system. French doctors prescribe fewer drugs, but more vitamins, long rests, and spa visits. Dirt and germs can strengthen one's terrain, thus there's less emphasis on daily bathing. The UF metaphor of the body is a machine that needs to be tended regularly to make sure it's running well. If something is wrong with the body, then doctors fix that part of the body in the same way the machines are repaired. American doctors are more likely to do surgery to fix, remove, replace, or change different parts of the body. Germs are a key threat to health, and people should avoid germs to be healthy. Thus, doctors prescribe antibiotics in higher doses compared to any other country. In China, the metaphor of yin and yang emphasizes opposite forces in balance. Imbalances are believed to lead to illnesses. Imbalances can be corrected with acupuncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and lifestyle changes. In France, the metaphor of the body is, quote, terrain, translated roughly into, quote, constitution or resistance, which emphasizes a sense of balance as the key to good health by supporting the immune system. French doctors prescribe fewer drugs, but more vitamins, long rests, and spa visits. Dirt and germs can strengthen one's terrain, thus there is less emphasis on daily bathing. The U.S. metaphor of the body as a machine that needs to be tended regularly to make sure it's running well. If something is wrong with the body, then doctors fix that part of the body in the same way the machines are repaired. American doctors are more likely to do surgery to fix, remove, replace, or change different parts of the body. Germs are a key threat to health, and people should avoid germs to be healthy. Thus, doctors prescribe antibiotics in higher doses compared to any other country. So here we can kind of see evidence of, I'd say, the kind of cross-cultural medical practices, but kind of the idea of culture or specific cultural practices of the self, of the community, these differences of individual collectivism, and kind of social role in the role of the environment in an individual's development being reflected in these medical practices. So you can kind of see with comparing the U.S. to France, with the U.S. kind of viewing their body as like a machine. So kind of like an asocial understanding of kind of the body, kind of disconnected from the environment, wherein kind of like we're just this machine that exists independently from environment or anybody else, and we are acting on the world for our own purposes. And sometimes that machine can have some issues, but you kind of just repair the machine, and then now you can go back to kind of acting in your own individual pursuit of whatever it is you're doing. Versus kind of more of France, kind of emphasizing the balance between really kind of interacting with the world. And you can kind of see this kind of even more demonstratively in kind of the example of China, with the metaphor being yin and yang, kind of the balance and kind of interacting with the world around you and having these other social forces impacting yourself. And these leads to different medical practices, wherein for France compared to the U.S., as stated, being higher, Americans being more likely to do surgery to fix and remove different parts of the body compared to French doctors, and kind of different views on germs in general. Medical practices study. The nature of medicine according to various cultures is underscored by a multinational study. Doctors and laypersons were asked questions about diet, eating, and health in 5 Western countries. Doctors showed much agreement with the laypersons from their own cultures compared to doctors from other countries. And what you see on the right in this figure is that on the left column, doctors and lay peoples from the same countries versus to the right, doctors from different countries. You can see that doctors and lay people from the same country having a higher correlation in their ideas about eating, dieting, and health kind of in general. So doctors and laypersons and just regular people from the same country having closer views of health in general than doctors across different countries. So again, kind of the idea here is that culture having an impact on the medical practices and views on diet, eating, health, and kind of just interacting in the world, development more globally, and thus kind of reflected in these correlations. And to wrap it up, both genetic variation through environmental adaptation and cultural selection pressures can influence biology. These biological consequences can be impactful, as in the case of obesity and mortality rates. And their cultural differences exist even in behaviors and practices with strong biological implications such as sleep, physical health, and medical practices. Thank you everyone for watching. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.